Hello there, students. Welcome to the second week of Intro to Biology. This week, let's just jump right into it. We're going to talk about chemistry. And I know what you might be thinking, chemistry, oh, I thought I was taking biology. Why on earth do I need to know about chemistry? Well, chemistry is the foundation of life, and life is biology. So we cannot go through biology without, on some level, tackling chemistry. This is why we're talking about this today, because atoms, it's the building block of all molecules in the universe. So um, atoms to molecules, and all this is matter. Whether it's air, soil, water, rocks, our cells, all of it interacts with each other. And really, that interaction is where chemistry comes in. So, if you understand these components and these principles, it's going to be very easy to understand the more difficult concepts. It's going to be more than just memorization for you. And that is always my goal, is this understanding this will help you think a lot more critically. So, looking at your reading this week, you'll know that we have our universe is comprised of matter, and matter, for a basic definition, is just anything that occupies space and has mass. Um, Elements are kind of the most basic nature or basic structure or uh, fundamental I don't want to say thing, but I'm losing my language here, but a fundamental building block of just matter or elements. And they're while we can get smaller into like protons and neutrons, what we see in nature, the smallest entity are elements. And they're unique. They each have a unique property, a specific chemical and physical property. Um, and as we know right now, based on just what we've discovered, and again, I don't know how recent this was, but as of the writing of this book, there was 98 natural elements in nature. But there's 118 known to science. So what does this mean? It means that roughly 20 elements are man-made. Okay? So the question you might be asking is, how does one make an element? We'll touch on that as we get going because we can do this. It's pretty cool how we do this, or it's cool that we can do this. The mechanisms go beyond this class, but if you ever want to look that up, it's actually pretty cool. But I will touch on that here in a second. Um, but yeah, the world around you is made of chemicals, made of elements, I should say, in some form or fashion. The most the most more essential elements to life, you are probably more familiar with. We have oxygen, we have carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Now, nitrogen we really don't talk about too much because it is primarily an atmospheric element, although it does occur in the body um, a little bit. So it does occur in the body just a little bit, but really, when you're looking at the complete compromise or what compromises the human body or life in general, uh, and this graph kind of breaks down again. This is life. You see oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen, CHO, comprise the human body. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Now, what does this look like? Let me get a different color here. So I'll take my navy blue. So if you think of something like water, H2O, there's your elements right there. If you look at stuff that the discharge from whenever we have respiration, you have CO2. Our body uses this stuff. And if you want to break it down into food, something like glucose, C6H12O6, all of this, carbon and hydrogen. Gases such as methane. Uh, Again, the bulk of what we're talking about that you are made up of, that life is made up of, is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And because these are elements, because these are matter, each one of these has mass. So you are a building block of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. That's where your mass comes from, is these elements. The most basic building blocks of life have mass. So you need to remember that, is that even in these the smallest entities, these things have mass. They're something. It's not this ethereal concept that we talk about, or that we just kind of talk about and there's no objective reality to it. It's very real. So when we're looking at an atom, we're looking at something that, again, we can quantify. That's a big thing with respect to biology, is you got to be able to quantify it. And you got to be able to observe it on some level. Remember our lecture from the previous chapter. And an atom is composed of two primary parts. You got the nucleus and you got the electrons. And we're going to start with the nucleus. And if I'm looking at the nucleus, this AI generated atom here, the nucleus is just another way of saying it's the center of the atom. Okay? It's the center of the atom. Now, inside the nucleus, you have two subatomic particles. The first one is protons, and the second is new neutrons, NEU. The thing about protons is they are positively charged, and neutrons, neutral, they don't have a charge. Okay? Protons carry a positive charge, neutrons carry a neutral charge. So if you're looking at the nucleus, the net charge of the nucleus is positive. Electrons, on the other hand, are not in the center, so they're these guys kind of orbiting around in what in these elliptical paths that we call orbitals. Okay? They're kind of orbiting the nucleus. But the thing about electrons is that they're negative. Now, in any atom, for the most part, I would say, as a general rule, you can expect the number of protons to equal the number of electrons. And what this means is, as an atom, generally, whatever atom you're looking at has a neutral charge. So the electrons cancel out the nucleus. So now, if you're looking at this, any atom, for the most part, there's going to be exceptions. There's going to be charges to atoms. That's part of nature. But when you're looking at the periodic table of elements, generally what you're seeing is a neutral element. So now, looking at this going forward, I want you to think about these things. That the overall charge of an atom is neutral, but the center has a charge, which brings me to my first question. What is the charge of an atom's nucleus? So, in order to answer this question, what's in the nucleus? And if you remember correctly, you have protons and neutrons. Protons with a positive charge, neutrons with oh, sorry, not a negative charge, a neutral charge. So the net gain is positive. So in here, so you might have some positives, some neutrals, some positives, some neutrals, some neutral. Get my drift here. Sorry, positive, neutral. Okay, so in here, positive. Out here, negative. Okay, negative Ghost Rider. The overall charge of the atom, though, is neutral. So my next question, food for thought, if you lose weight, where does it go? So let's just say, for starters, you lose 10 pounds. You go on a little diet, do a little exercising, train for a marathon, whatever. So my question is, where does it go? Where does and I'm going to put this in quotation marks, the weight go? Now, you might be thinking, okay, it's excess removal in the form of your excrement or your urine or your sweat, and you're not wrong when you think some of it is lost in that manner. Um, but that is only about the tip of the iceberg, if I were to put it succinctly. So if you lose weight, where does it go? Most of the mass that you lose whenever you lose weight is exhaled. So really, it's this CO2 that exhales. So whenever you lose weight, again, if you're looking at like food you eat, fat, food you eat, again, normally goes back to this glucose. We'll talk a lot about glucose in this class. So C6H12O6, each one of eat, these carbon atoms, these hydrogen atoms, these oxygen atoms has mass. Okay. If you look at something like a hydrocarbon, like or like a fat that's like, oh, I don't know, we'll just make one up here, like a C3H6C3. I think that's a good one. That has mass. Okay. All of these have mass. When your body breaks it down, it doesn't just destroy them. That's not what happens. In fact, the C's and the O's get converted to CO2. So when your body's done using it, your body just expels most of the mass in the form of CO2. Now, you can even think about this when you go to the gym, or you go on a jog, or you lift weights, whatever you want to look at, whatever exercise, is that the more you intensify, the heavier you breathe. So you're expending a lot of energy. Your body is acting like this factory that's just burning fuel. And not that it's burning it, but your body is repurposing it. It's breaking bonds to make energy and expelling the waste as CO2. Well, that CO2 is mass, and that mass adds up to the point where you start losing a significant amount of weight if you're, following a proper diet and exercising. So where does it go? You breathe it out. So what does this mean? It means that elements, and again, elements have mass, and not the Catholic mass. That joke is made entirely too often, but elements have mass. Okay. And we break this down by looking at we can look at the elements themselves. So let me go to my blackboard here, and I will give me my yellow marker here. So when I'm looking at the a chemical element here, so I'm going to take hydrogen, or actually, you know what? We'll take carbon. We'll look at this here in a second. Good old C. Now, carbon, a lot of times, you'll see it looking like this. You may even see a little notation down here. You don't always see that though. Um, More often than not, you're gonna see it looking something like this. Let me get some white here so I can distinguish this. Um, this guy right here is known as the atomic number. So the atomic number. And the atomic number tells me the number of protons in that element. So there are 6 protons in this element. Another thing to think about as we look at protons is it's the identity of the element. What do I mean by this? Is that carbon has 6 protons. Another way to look at it is any element with 6 protons is carbon. So carbon has 6 protons. Any element with 6 protons is carbon. If I up it to 7, it is no longer carbon. It is now nitrogen. Okay? That being said, you also have, again, the chemical element here, or the chemical symbol here, which I could actually remove because as long as I have 6, I have carbon. As long as I have carbon, I have 6. Okay? So right here, we have something called the mass number or the atomic mass. Okay? That's what we're looking at. Now, I'm going to lose all my work here, but I'm going to go back here. So you're looking at or the atomic weight, I should say. Let me get my good color here. Get some red. So yeah, the mass number and the atomic weight, what we just looked at, that 12.011 is the atomic weight of carbon in this particular instance. So how do you come up with this? Why 12.011? Well, for starters, it's one way to look at this is that let me go back to my black screen here and get my yellow out. Is carbon, well, yeah, at least we'll go this way. So carbon has six protons. And remember how I said if it usually has six protons, it has six electrons, okay? Now, we also have that atomic mass at 12.011. Now, this 12 here, usually more often than not, is a summation of the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. So in the instance of carbon, you have 12 protons, or you have 12 protons and neutrons, and we know six are protons. So how many neutrons do we have? Well, in a standard, most occurring element version of carbon, we have six neutrons. Okay? Now, here's what's cool. To keep it carbon, let me get my white here. To keep it carbon, you always have to have six protons. If I change it, it's a different element. Seven protons becomes nitrogen. However, electrons and neutrons can change. Okay? Carbon, and in this particular instance, we call it carbon 12 because you have six and six. That's the most abundant version of carbon. It's the most abundant isotope is carbon 12 when it comes to carbon. Now, I can change this number right here. I can change the number of neutrons. And if I were to say, and again, here's this atomic mass number that becomes 12, but if I were to change that and add a neutron, let's say I have seven neutrons, I have an isotope that is, whoops, that is carbon 13. Sorry, I'm getting a little. So carbon 13, because six protons, come on, and seven neutrons becomes carbon 13. If I had eight neutrons, it'd be carbon 14. The most abundant uh, carbon atom, though, is carbon 12. So like over here, like 98% of carbon is C12, carbon 12, with the other 2% being carbon 13, carbon 14. So this is where isotopes come in. Isotopes are just the same element in this case, the same number of protons, but a differing number of neutrons. Now, if I take all the elements in the world or in the universe and I average them together, I kind of weight the averages here. I essentially get, again, protons, neutrons. This is essentially what I get. I get an atomic weight. And that's why this number is like 12.011. And you'll see that with a bunch of elements. Hydrogen's like 1.008. Okay. That's why, because you're summing all the isotopes. These isotopes occur naturally in nature, but you don't see them as readily as you say carbon 12, which is the carbon that we associate most with carbon. So we're looking at atomic weight, and the definition here should make more sense. The calculated mean of an element's naturally occurring isotopes, and it's often a fraction because, again, you don't, you're not going to get a whole number. Um, and again, some periodic tables will even include the mass number, which the mass number you really can just take the atomic weight, that whole number. So we'll say carbon, you have six, you have 12.011. Some of them will include a mass number either here or here to show you that, hey, this is the number of protons and neutrons. Here's a number, like this is the number of protons, neutrons. This is the number of protons. Here's your mass. It breaks it down a little bit better. But the atomic number, the big thing I want you to remember is protons stay constant. If I change the protons, I change the element. Okay. Um, the mass number is indicative of the number of protons and neutrons. You can also use the atomic weight to figure out that whole number helps. And that atomic weight has to do more with the summation and the average of all the masses of all the isotopes of that particular element. Okay. So knowledge check. What two subatomic particles constitute the mass of an atom? Now we just talked about this. Where's all the mass? The mass number tells us this, or the atomic weight, whatever you want to look at, and that is protons and neutrons. Okay. Electrons don't really have much mass to them. They contribute negative or negligibly to mass as far as mass goes, I should say. Okay. So electrons really don't contribute to the mass. The protons and neutrons are the bulk of the mass. Um, so knowledge check. Which subatomic particle determines chemical reactivity? Now, I haven't really talked about that. But if I look at the nucleus, look at my dummy atom over here, the nucleus just kind of lives right here, just kind of exists. Okay. So again, you have your positives, your neutrals, so on and so forth. It just kind of exists. But surrounding the nucleus in these sort of orbital like ellipses right here that you see, you have electrons. Now, if I'm just looking at a physics standpoint, and I think if I'm wearing like kind of like a bubble boy or like, there's a bubble surrounding this entity right here, this nucleus. If two bubbles hit, it's the outer edges that hit. If two balls hit, like you have a ball and a ball, okay, the outer edge is what hits, okay? So think about that whenever you're thinking about atoms, is that the thing that hits, the thing that interacts with each other are these electrons. So anytime you're talking about the reactivity, it's the two things that are going to interact with each other, or the things that are going to interact with each other between atoms is the electron. Okay? Electrons play a vital role in the chemical reactivity of our elements. Okay? So again, as I say, keep that in mind. Now, as we look at the periodic table, um, I want to show you what this looks like because the periodic table it doesn't make much sense if you don't know what you're looking at. But the periodic table does have an organization pattern to it. Elements are grouped by like in order by atomic number, so increasing by the number of what's that, protons. So you have one equals hydrogen, two equals helium, three equals lithium, so on and so forth. Six equals carbon, so on and so forth. I'm trying to remember the rest of them. I do 55 equals cesium. I remember that because my dad's Charles Stevens and he was born in 1955. So I always remember that one. But they're grouped by shared properties. Now, I don't want you to really, this is not a good periodic table. This is AI generated. But essentially, when you're looking at a, um, a periodic table, the elements in one column have similar properties as the one in the next column, or different than the next column, and so on and so forth. In fact, let me clear this and I will show you when if I look at this periodic table right here, um, the elements all in this group here react very similarly. The elements in this group act very similarly. This group, ad nauseum. I want to keep doing all that. Okay. Now, there's a reason why they act this way, and it has to do with electrons. The reactivity has everything to do with electrons. Okay. Now, I jumped ahead in the slides a little bit because I wanted you to see all that. Let me go back. Where was I? So there's the periodic table. So if you can understand the periodic table, you can understand how elements will react. So let's go back to our carbon atom. Okay. Again, if you were to break this down, you should know this atomic number. This is your symbol, which is kind of redundant because, again, if I have six, I should know carbon. This is actually redundant. I mean, some say it, and then this is your weight. Okay, we should be reviewing at this point. Okay, but every element breaks down to this structure. And again, in some instances, you might have a 12 up here to say that that's the mass number of that's the summation of the protons plus the neutrons right here. Some have it, some don't. But if you don't have that, you can use this whole number to gauge it. Okay. This is kind of the structure of chemistry or the periodic table. Okay. So we talked about this, isotopes and radioisotopes. Isotopes is just basically the same element, different mass. We talked about this earlier with carbon 12, carbon 13, carbon 14, and you have six protons, six neutrons. In this case, you have six protons, seven neutrons, six protons, eight neutrons. Okay. All of these are different isotopes. Same element because they have the same number of protons, but different mass because they have a different number of neutrons. The interesting thing about this is if you ever hear about carbon dating, we use carbon 14 to determine that. This is how the importance of something like carbon 14, it's used in carbon dating. Now, the structure of it and why that happens goes beyond really what we're talking about. If you ever take this course in the hybrid fashion, I talk a little bit more about that. Um, but essentially, what ends up happening is this is not the most stable, and over time, carbon 14 through a little bit of radiation becomes nitrogen. Like one of the protons eventually changes. It just ups it to seven to be more stable because you can only pack in so many neutrons and protons into a nucleus before it becomes unstable. Carbon 14 is not the most stable, so eventually it converts to nitrogen to stabilize. Over time, that stabilization happens more and more. You see less and less carbon 14, and you'll see more nitrogen. And that ratio between those two tells us how long that animal's been dead. So that's kind of how that happens. You don't need to necessarily know that. No isotopes. Carbon 14, and carbon dating would be kind of interesting to know. It's good barroom trivia, but I'm not going to ask you to ever to dissect how carbon dating works. So another question that you might be asking, and let me zoom in here on your periodic table. So if you zoom in on the periodic table here, let's go to carbon, and you'll see carbon is six, and that mass is 12.011. Okay. So the question you should be asking here is what unit is the mass? And really, the unit is grams. Now, if you've ever objectively looked at grams as a method of measurement, or I guess weight is a way to look at it, grams are pretty heavy. But carbon, one atom of carbon does not equal 12 grams. Okay. One atom of carbon does not equal 12 grams. To visually, how do I put this? To completely understand the difference between something like, and let me get my blue here. So if I were to look at atoms on just a microscopic level, carbon would kind of seem like hydrogen from a mass standpoint because they're so minute, so tiny. Well, there's this guy back in the day, Avogadro, who found this number, Avogadro's number, and basically said if I take one atom of carbon and multiply it by this number, I can begin to see differences in the atom as far as mass goes. So if I take hydrogen and multiply it by this number, I would get a number. So with hydrogen, actually, if I take it by and multiply by this number, which is a very big number, I get 1.008 grams. Carbon, I get 12.011 grams. This number helps me differentiate on a mass level carbon and hydrogen, or carbon and oxygen, or carbon and boron, or lead. So anytime you see that mass number, that 12.01, that 1.088, you're looking not at an individual atom, but a lot of atoms to see the difference. So here's your periodic table of elements. Okay. And again, remember what I said here is that um, you have a group here, a group here, group here, 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 and here. Okay? All of these guys tend to react similar. That is a terrible square. I'm sorry. All these guys over here have similar properties. Okay? They're very similar in how they react with each other. So hydrogen acts very similar to lithium. What do I mean by that? Okay, so let's clear this bad boy. Let's go to my. So when you're looking at hydrogen, again, we'll just start with hydrogen. Hydrogen equals one proton, one electron. Okay, so hydrogen, and here is my orbital. So here, the H will constitute the nucleus here, and surrounding the atom is going to be an electron. Okay, one electron, one proton, one electron. Hydrogen has no neutrons, so remember that. Um, but hydrogen plus this electron. So this electron's kind of floating around here. Each element, again, going around the element is something called an orbital. Electrons live live in orbital. Okay, the orbitals. That's where they exist. Now, hydrogen, this first orbital, there's many orbitals. Your first orbital would love to have two electrons in it, and your second orbital loves to have eight electrons. That's the stability, just the kind of that attraction level of electrons. In the first orbital, they love to have two electrons. The second and third orbitals, they love to have eight electrons. Now, we're not going to go too far into the third orbital. It's these two orbitals you need to be concerned with. So I'm going to lose my work here, but I'm going to go back. Um, once you get two electrons, okay, once you get two electrons, you then go to the second orbital and you start putting electrons there. So two electrons, and then you jump to the second orbital where you start trying to fill up eight. Okay, so hydrogen right here, if I come up here, living here, has one electron in its outer shell. It has one electron, which is the same as all these guys. Now, this is the second orbital, the third orbital, the fourth orbital, all the way down, but they have one electron in that shell, that outer shell. Um, whereas these guys right here have two electrons in their outer shell, and so on and so forth. You notice that there's no two here on this second column here. It's because as soon as that hits two, it shoots over to helium. And helium has a full shell because it has two electrons, which is a similar principle or uh, similar feature that these other elements have. And I'll talk about that. So let's go back to our blackboard here. You have hydrogen, has one electron in it. Ideally, it would want to do one of two things. It would either like to have two electrons in its shell or no electrons in its shell. It would be happy with either. One makes it kind of unstable. But what's really nice is if I can get another hydrogen, well, these guys will be happy sharing electrons. And this is how you see hydrogen. That's a terrible H, by the way. This is why a lot of times elemental hydrogen is abbreviated as H2, or that's how you see it as H2, because hydrogen will not, most times, is not stable to exist alone, so it'll find another hydrogen to pair with. So H2, that's that stability. That outer shell is satisfied. So the outer shell is satisfied. Okay. So going back to our elements here, hydrogen, uh, right here has that one extra electron. Now, once I have two protons, it becomes helium. And helium's nice because helium's happy. So let me go back to my shell here. Here's my element. Here's helium, and it has two electrons. And this is good. This is very good because helium is very stable. It is not really reactive. It doesn't react. You can't, it doesn't do much other than be helium. And that's the property of everybody in this column up here. Okay. All these guys have let me get my red here. These guys have a full shell. Now, this guy has a full first shell, second shell, third shell, all the way down. Okay. But the shells are full. And the idea is that helium, neon, argon, krypton, xenon, radon, all these guys are very inert. They don't really react with anything. Whereas the guys in the first row, they ideally, because they have one extra electron, they like to give it away or share it. Now, if I go, let me eliminate my markings here. If I were to, let me get some white here. If I were to look at these guys here, like chlorine, I'm going to go back here. Chlorine is nice because in its valence, it has one, two, three, four, five, six. It has seven electrons, which means it really wants one more. Okay. That's just the nature of it. It wants to fill its outer shell. So this is what we call the octet rule, is that these valence and the first shell is the duet rule. So depending on where you're looking at. So this is the duet rule or the octet rule. But right now we're looking at the octet rule. So seven electrons in this outer orbital, it really wants to find another electron. So where is that electron going to be found? Okay, I'm going to lose my work again. Well, which ones of these columns has one electron that it's willing to donate? Okay. And that is one of the worst. Sorry, I'm working at an angle here. So yeah, right here. All these guys have one electron that they're just wanting to give away. So if you were to look at some of these, what could you pair over here? So you actually have some interesting things. You have, you can do chlorine and hydrogen. That's HCl. That's hydrochloric acid. Another common one, NaCl, which is table salt. You have potassium chloride, another type of salt. Lithium bromide, another type of salt. HF is hydrofluoric acid. These are all elements that they are the elements that want to react together. So that's why they're grouped this way, is that these guys in this row one tend to react a lot with these guys. Um, you see that kind of happening in other areas too. But for the most part, when you're looking at column one, column seven, that's what you're looking for. And I can show you that again. You have chlorine, and let's say you have hydrogen. We'll make him smaller because he has smaller. He has one, two, three, four, five, six, seven. They tend to want to share because hydrogen's like, yeah, you can have it. I don't mind. Chlorine's like, I'll gladly take it. And so chlorine kind of hogs that electron, and that's what you have there. That's why that bond is so prominent. Okay, so hopefully that makes a little bit more sense, and we'll go further into this going straight forward. But again, in group one, that group one up here, again, right here, hydrogen notwithstanding, because it's technically not a metal, it's an alkali metal. Um, Group two, the alkali earth metal. 3 through 12 right here is the transition metals. We don't really talk about that. As you get further into chemistry, you'll learn more about that. Group 17 here, the ones that have the seven or they're just missing one electron. They have the seven electrons in their outer shell. Um, that's a term called halogens. So you may like heard halogen light bulbs. That's where that term comes from right there. Um, they're very reactive. They tend to pull electrons, which electron is a charge, and that's where you get the halogen bulb from. And then group 18, the ones that are over here are your noble gases. I'll just say Ng because I don't have any. I can't write in white over here. But those are your noble gases. And those that really don't react with anything. Okay. So that's just a little bit of information there. Now, I'm not going to expect you to know the group names. I will expect you to know like, hey, let me get some color change here. I will expect you to know like this is the inert group. They don't really react. Halogens, they're one electron. That's group 17. But if you understand this, you'll understand why like H and Cl react together. But these are like the two big groups. If I were to say, hey, an alkali metal or a halogen, you probably should understand that. But I'm not going to expect you to know the transition metals. But these three right here, I would not be surprised if I just reference them. And this is terrible. So yeah. So like I could ask you something like, let's go to white here. So I could ask a question like, why is uh helium inert? I could ask that question, and your answer should constitute something about the valence, the duet rule. You could even say, hey, helium, two electrons, and he's happy. He doesn't want to react. That would be a good way to answer that question. But I could ask the same question about argon, xenon, um, so on and so forth. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, moving right along. So yeah, this is where the Bohr model comes in of atoms, and this is where the electron shell in the Bohr model takes place here. Niels Bohr kind of depicted the atom to not just be this like stationary kind of like where all the electrons live. Like there's not just one orbital where the electrons live. So you have your nucleus here. Not all the electrons are just living right here. This is why you see orbitals that are in this manner, and that's not the nucleus, by the way. This is the nucleus. But you see the this atom or this electron, this electron, this electron, this electron are all living in different orbitals. So they'll fill the closest one and then they'll go to the next one. So each one can hold up to 8 electrons, except for this first one, which holds 2 electrons. Okay. The duet rule versus the octet rule. And we talk about that right here. Here's the octet rule in valence shells. The octet rule just states that atoms tend to gain and lose electrons until they are surrounded by 8 valence electrons, except for that first group, that first row in the periodic table, hydrogen and helium. It's a duet rule. Okay, 2 electrons. All right, that is fundamental. So here you go. Helium, complete outer octet shell, outer, not octet, outer valence shell with 2 electrons. Neon is a complete outer shell with 8 electrons. And you'll see that in the periodic table. Let me go back to that real quick. You'll see that these guys, and again, I'll come out here. These guys here, helium has that 2 electrons. These guys have 8 in their outer shell. So more or less, that's what we're talking about. So yeah, and this is why sodium and chlorine react well together. Sodium has one to offer. This guy has 7. He wants one. He's very greedy, so tends to accept one to achieve stability. Sodium's like, I don't need this one. I'll be generous. Okay. So when we're looking at this, so this is important to understand. So you look at something like sodium and chlorine. Okay. Let's go to our lovely blackboard here and let me get my yellow. Here we go. So remember, you have sodium, and you have chlorine. Now, sodium's got the one electron. This guy has seven electrons. And if I were to draw this Na, it's got the one electron, and chlorine, it's a little bit bigger. Two, three, four, five. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven. Okay. What ends up happening, this is something called an ionic bond that sodium and chlorine do. Chlorine's kind of green. It's like I'll take it. Like I'll take the electron, and sodium's very generous. It's like I'll give the electron away. Well, in this particular configuration, what ends up happening is sodium kind of starts giving its electron over, and essentially what happens is it kind of loses an electron, and chlorine gains an electron. It's really what they're sharing, but not really. So sodium tends to donate it to the point where sodium, because it loses an electron, let's just say Na, it becomes positively charged, and chlorine becomes negatively charged. So if something is charged, whether it's positive or negative, we call that term an ion. And in this case, it's an ionic bond. So ionic bond, right? I'm going to lose my work. Ionic bond. Let me get my red here. Here we go. Ionic bond. Ion just means it's charged. So what happens here? There are two separate charges. Sodium loses that outer electron. It kind of gives it to chlorine, and it becomes positively charged. And that chlorine gains the electron, it becomes negatively charged. And we mark that in an ionic notation as such. Na plus Cl minus. So that's how they form. Uh, that's how they form ionic bonds. Is because sodium tends to want to lose an electron. Chlorine tends to want to gain one. And when it does that, then they attract each other better. Now they can share it, they can pull it from each other, but that's the ionic bond concept that you're looking at. So another thing we look at, and I apologize for the small text here, but these are is something called covalent bonds. And so co equals like together, uh sorry, co. So like CO, you can look at like shared. This is a little bit easier to think of, cooperate. But covalent bonds form when atoms like share electrons. So these bonds are actually much more strong than common ionic bonds. So HCl, they tend to break apart easily because the charge is so high. They want to separate. They're not very stable, which is why salt dissolves in water. But atoms can share one, two, three pairs of electrons, and this is actually how they become very stable. The one that we looked at where they share, remember H2? H2 is a covalent bond. Now, another one we look at is O2. It's a covalent bond. Because if I look at oxygen, let's go back to my periodic table here, and I look at oxygen. I zoom in here. Oxygen is in that eighth group. It has eight protons, okay? Um, and it has about eight neutrons in there, which means it has eight electrons. Now, remember, two uh, are in the first group. So in the first octet, or in the first valence, I'm sorry, the first shell, which means in its second shell it has six. That's why it's in that sixth group. I can go back and show you that again, but I go to my whiteboard here. Oxygen tends to have, this is oxygen, and it wants to have eight. So how many more does it need? It needs two more. Well, what's nice is another oxygen can come in, and it's like, hey, I'll loan you two if you loan me two. And so what you end up having here is you have oxygen sharing two electrons equally and making O2, oxygen. That's why you see oxygen labeled like that. That is a covalent bond. So whenever, because it's sharing two pairs of electrons, that's very stable. They're not greedy. One doesn't want one more than the other. That's a covalent bond. Mhm. So looking at this a little bit more in depth, what you now have to look at is you have this concept of a polar versus a non-polar covalent bond. And I know I'm probably saturating you with some knowledge here. Uh, but let's go to my black screen here, and I will go to my ink color. So remember, you have the ionic bond, which is when like Na plus Cl minus, again, lost an electron, gained an electron. They combine to form NaCl, which is table salt. Um, these are very unstable. They tend to want to disassociate. So these are unstable. And now you have covalent bonds, which is sharing. Okay? So think of it as sharing. We talked about two big ones like O2 and H2. As far as covalent bonds, they like to share their electrons. Um, those two are actually in a subcategory called nonpolar covalent. Okay? Nonpolar covalent means they share them equally. What does this mean? Um, let me get rid of this because now we're going to look at polar covalent. Okay? Polar covalent. Polar covalent just means that they share, but there's some greed attached to it. The classic example is water. Okay? H2O. So now remember, oxygen, yeah, there's oxygen. It's got, and then there's a big electron there, big electron there. And remember, you have hydrogen and hydrogen. Okay? Hydrogen has its one electron. So here we have some sharing of the electrons here. Hydrogen satisfied, oxygen satisfied there, and so on and so forth. Okay? The thing about oxygen with hydrogen is hydrogen, again, tends to want to give it away, but an oxygen wants to take it. So this electron, this lone electron here, let me get my white here, tends to want to go this direction. So within this particular system here, yes, overall, it's neutral because, yeah, there's some neutrality to the system, but oxygen is more what we call electronegative. It's not really negative, but it's pulling the electrons closer to it, and it's making them electronegative, and it's making the hydrogen atoms electropositive because it's losing the electron. So this is why water is a polar covalent bond because it's polar, they're covalent, it's sharing, but there's some polarity to it, where this is more positive, and this is more negative than if they were standing alone. So another example of polar covalent bonds is methane, and we'll talk about that because carbon, this is why carbon is really good with nonpolar elements or nonpolar molecules. Oxygen is very good with polar. So if you see oxygen in a system, it's usually pretty polar. Uh, so in the presence of oxygen, if you don't see oxygen, it's probably nonpolar. So something like methane, CH4, nonpolar. A lot of your fats are nonpolar, but your carbs are very polar. They have oxygen in them. So yeah. So something like glucose C6H12O6, very polar. Body can dissolve it. Fats, not so much. So that interaction right there, where the that polarity within the system is within hydrogen, specifically water, is called hydrogen bonding. Or That electronegativity creates hydrogen bonding. What do I mean by that? They're just weak attractions between slightly positive hydrogen atoms and slightly negative atoms. What do I mean by that? Let's go to my trusty blackboard here and go to yellow. So what does this look like? So you have, let's just draw. We're not going to put the letters in there. Well, we will. Okay, so I clear. So you have, again, oxygen, oxygen, oxygen with its two, right? You have the hydrogen over here with its one, and you have the hydrogen over here with its one. Okay? So remember, these guys are sharing. Sharing is caring. And let's get some white. These guys are sharing. These guys are sharing. Hydrogen is a little bit more positive now. Electropositive. Oxygen, electronegative. Okay. Now, what this means is that there could be a neighboring ion. So you have some ions floating around, maybe. And if one ion is negative, it could be attracted to this hydrogen. Now, in the case of water, this could be another H2O where the oxygen wants to form an interaction with that hydrogen. This is why we call it hydrogen bonding. So the oxygen wants to form a bond there, and maybe another H2O, the hydrogen, since it's slightly positive, wants to form a bond here. Sorry for my. So what you end up having is you have all these molecules of water that are bound together through this process of hydrogen bonding. The hydrogen bonds to the oxygen, so on and so forth. Now, initially, it has to make that bind with elemental hydrogen um, to make the individual atom or molecule of water. But collectively, as those atoms start forming together, this is one of those properties of water, which is why you have water when it kind of beads together. Waters tend to be very attracted to each other, something called cohesion. So water tends to bead together for that reason, not cohesions, cohesion, apologies. So that's what hydrogen bonding does. There's just these weak interactions. Why is this important? Well, it's important because hydrogen bonding is a building block of your DNA. So when A to T and G to C, which we'll talk about later, these are hydrogen bonds. Protein folding, whenever your proteins fold into configurations, that's hydrogen bonding that helps maintain three-dimensional structure. You disrupt that structure in your system, your proteins can't fold properly, and you code for different, uh, you code for different, or the amino acids can code for different proteins, which can vitally alter the structure of your genome. So this is something to think about. This is why this is important. You can't escape this. So water, why is water so important? Water is important because it consists of it makes about 60 to 70% of the human body, and it's essential for all life as we know it. Um, so yeah, so we have water, and we're going to talk about this idea of water's polarity. Water's polarity with the slightly positive hydrogen atoms, the slightly negative oxygen atoms, creates those hydrogen bombs and makes water unique. But water also has some pretty cool features. It has a high heat capacity. What does that mean? Water can absorb a lot of heat. We'll talk about this on the next slide, but sweating is an example. Your body releases water to cool you. It pulls heat out of a system. Um, this is also interesting because if you were to be in 70-degree weather, you would like outside, you'd be fine, but 70-degree water, you'd eventually die because it pulls heat out of your system. Um, it pulls heat out of your body. It's an excellent solvent. It dissolves stuff really nicely. And that is because of that hydrogen bonding, that electronegativity that we talked about. But it has to be polar. And I'll talk about that in a second. Cohesion and adhesion, water stick together and it adheres to like tubing. So whenever you look at a tube, like let's just say that's like a blood vessel right here, you'll notice that water tends to have this sort of concave shape. It's because water sticks. That hydrogen bonding, that H plus bonding is nice for that. And that's how the capillary action in your veins occurs. Yeah, so more of the same thing, sweating, kind of nature's cooling system. Another thing that we look at is ice. Ice is interesting because when ice freezes, that hydrogen bonding, all that structure becomes less dense, and that's why ice floats. I don't expect you to know that, but it's just a cool little tidbit to throw in there. That's why ice floats, is because the hydrogen bonding gets stabilized, and you see a little bit less density, which is why it floats. Which is you want to happen because if ice didn't float, it would sink to the bottom, and basically you would never have that insulation and from the outside elements. Oh, that's back. So yeah, looking ahead, hydrogen bonds and DNA, that's fundamental. Understanding that concept and how things break apart. It has to be strong, but not too strong, and that's where hydrogen bonding comes in. But terminology that we look at with certain properties of elements and properties of molecules and bigger macromolecules are these terms hydrophilic and hydrophobic. Okay, to the blackboard. So hydrophilic, so hydro equals water. And you have two words, phobic, which equals fear, so phobia, and philic, phileo, like uh, means love. So you can either be water loving or water fearing, or water hating, they sometimes say. What does this mean? Okay. Well, you remember how hydrogen and oxygen have that electronegativity to them. So take something like salt, which has that slightly positive Na, that slightly negative Cl. If you add it to water, the system tends to dissolve pretty nicely in water. Sodium does because of this polarity that happens. Okay? So you put salt in some water, the salt will dissociate into its constituents, its Na and its Cl, because ions, because the positive side of hydrogen, the negative side, tends to and and break that apart. So something polar, this is what we call water loving. It loves to be in water. So this is that hydrophilic. Sodium chloride is very hydrophilic. But we take something like an oil or a fat. Um, Oil does not have any oxygen to it. There's very little O2. So there's no O2 to kind of have that electronegativity. There's no ions in it. It's mostly carbon and hydrogen, which whenever you do that, you will have your oil on the bottom and your water at the top because they can't mix. There's no charge here to separate it out. This is what's called hydrophobic. Okay. Now, why is this important? Well, when we get into your cell membrane, okay, and that's not good. Let me get back. When we get into your cell membrane, you have, we're going to call this the hydro, this is the hydrophilic side, and you have the hydrophobic interior, hydrophobic. So it's got this layer, it's got these two layers, this and this side, these two sides, because this is all an aqueous environment, it's a water environment, AQ. You have water here, and you got to keep the inside and the outside separated. So you have this hydrophobic fat-based tails that keep water from, or keep stuff from the inside from being outside and vice versa. That's why it's very important. Those concepts of hydrophilic, hydrophobic. Hydrophilic tends to have a charge, and then hydrophobic tends to have no charge. Okay? So what does that mean as far as acids and bases? Okay, so are a acids are just basically anything that can increase hydrogen in a system or hydrogen ions. So remember, let me get blue here. I'm not explaining that properly. But in any system, if I were to add a substance to water, how that substance reacts tells me if it's an acid or a base. So if I add a substance to water, okay, and I get a bunch of H plus ions, that's an acid. If I add that same substance to H2O and H plus goes down, or I get these hydroxide ions, that's a base. Okay? So we measure acidity and on a level called the pH scale. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Now, the pH scale is just logarithmic. And I don't expect you to know the math to that, but every increase, so let's just say we have water to start off with. Water is lovely because it has a pH of 7, which is in the middle. This is neutral. It's not acid, it's not a base. It's just in the middle. Um, but as I go down the pH scale, so let's say it becomes a pH of 6, well, that's acidic. If it goes to an 8, well, that's basic. Okay? So we're measuring levels, we're measuring acidity on this scale. Now, you might think, okay, it drops from 7 to 6, but because it's logarithmic, the log base 10, every integer, so every plus 1 is 10 times more acidic. So a pH of 6 is 10 times acidic as pH 7. Okay? That's what that means. So on and so forth. 7 is 10 times more acidic than 8, so on and so forth. 8 is 10 times more basic than 7. The higher the number, the more basic. The lower the number, the more acidic. Water has a pH of 7. Your blood has a pH of about 7.35. Okay? And it needs to maintain that. If you get too acidic, you go into something called ketoacidosis, and that's what diabetics have to struggle with. So remember that. But yeah, this pH scale. So how does this actually work? Well, let's ask a question real quick. Um, a solution with pH 3 is how many times more acidic than pH 5? Now pause and ask yourself that question. Well, we just talked about this. If we go on the logarithmic scale, um, 5 to 4 is 10 times, and 4 to 3 is 10 times. So what's 10 times 10? 100. Okay. So um, this is kind of out of order. Let me see. Do I have this? Okay. So this is something that's interesting. So when we're looking at water, water is actually pretty cool. And I want to explain this before I go on. Is all that hydrogen bonding to the black screen? Let's go. Again, you have H2O. Okay. Now, all that electronegativity that we talked about earlier, oxygen, hydrogen, basically what ends up happening is in some cases, it happens with water, it happens in equal amounts, is the hydrogen from one H2O can be pulled over to another water to make something called H3O plus. We call that hydronium. And that leaves us with an OH, or a hydroxide ion. So again, but just as quickly as this happens, that hydrogen can move back over here, and then again, this will become H2O and H2O. So when we're looking at acidic versus basic, the more H plus I have, the more hydronium I have in a system, it's more acidic. The more OH I have in a system, it's more basic. Okay? So hydrogen or water is really nice because the acidic and the basic elements of it, it's constantly shifting. H2O is H2O, yes, it is existing. That is the element, or that is the molecule. but a little bit of it is H3O plus and a little bit of is OH because of that electronegativity. The hydrogens are being pulled, the oxygens are pulling more hydrogen. It's happening at equal rates. So essentially, what happens is these sort of cancel out. They're there, but they're there in the same quantity. So you have an equal number of hydronium and an equal number of of basic element of hydroxide ions. So this is also annotated as H plus. So an acid can, in an aqueous environment, in water, an acid will increase this and decrease this, and a base will do the opposite. It will increase OH and decrease hydronium. Okay? So this property of water is it's self-ionizing. It ionizes itself. It creates hydronium and oxygen and hydroxide in the same amounts. But if I introduce an acid to it, let's go back. If I introduce an acid to it, so if I say H2O and I take something like HCl, hydrochloric acid, okay, what ends up happening is HCl in an aqueous environment produces H plus and Cl. So when I have this abundance of H plus, what water needs to do is essentially what it has to do is it tries to neutralize this H plus. And what ends up doing is all that water begins to pull hydrogen into itself, and you increase hydronium. Because if I have H2O and a lot of H plus, that H plus has to go somewhere. And it goes to H3O plus. It becomes hydronium. So there's more hydronium in this system, and there's not as much OH. This goes down, okay? Because as I put a hydrogen there, and I pull oxygen or I pull hydrogen away from hydrochloric acid, the there's no balance with the hydroxide ion. So hydroxide goes down, H3O plus goes up. That's how you know an acid is an acid. I add it to water, and if H3O plus goes up, it's an acid. If OH goes up, it's a base. Ammonia is an example of a base that that would increase an OH concentration. So let me go back here. But yeah, this is why water is very, very important to biological systems, is it acts as this buffer. It can actually have a self-ionization process. And if I go back, um, this is the difference between strong acids and weak acids. Strong acids completely disassociate. That's white. That's not going to show up. So I have hydrochloric acid right here is a strong acid, sulfuric acid. It completely dissociates. All the H plus gets thrown into the water, and you have a bunch of hydronium produced in water. So the pH goes up. Weak acids, the bond is a little bit stronger. So not all the H plus ions get dispersed. That's just a weak acid. That's the difference. Same thing with strong bases. Sodium hydroxide, potassium hydroxide, they disassociate. They increase the OH in the system. So the OH goes up and hydronium goes down. Um, so that would increase pH. Weak bases, same thing. Ammonia, pyridine, those don't disassociate as readily. We also use to look something called a litmus test to determine if a liquid is acidic or basic. Basically, it's a strip, and it's a strip that turns red in acidic solutions, blue in basic solutions. It stays purple if it's neutral. Um, and again, remember, neutral just means H3O plus and OH the same amounts. There's the same because in water that's constantly going back and forth. Okay, so if it's purple, it's just saying that H3O plus OH ions are in the same quantity. As I add an acid to an aqueous environment, so aqueous just equals H2O, an increase in hydronium would show me a red acidic litmus paper, and a basic would show me blue. Now, that doesn't tell you how acidic that is. It just tells you that it is acidic. And again, going back to the hydronium that we were talking about earlier, hydronium, the OH, helps you to understand why water is able to do what it does. So your body has a bunch of buffers, and a buffer just basically means it absorbing the acidity or basicity in whatever, or alkalinity, I should say, in your body. So how they work, let's say your blood gets a little bit too acidic. Well, your system can release something like a bicarbonate, or it can release a bicarbonate or carboxylic acid, something along that nature to neutralize the acidity, to bring the pH down. Um, if that gets altered, or if that gets changed, if that gets modified in some way, that pH can rise or skyrocket and cause death. You need to keep your pH here. So let's just say, let's see if I can diagram this. Um, so you have something in your system. Let's see if I can get my trusty go yellow. Um, you have something in your system called bicarbonate. So HCO3. This is called bicarbonate, and your body can release this depending on um, if your blood's getting more acidic. If your blood's getting more acidic and you're seeing a lot of H3O plus in your system, what ends up happening is this negative charge can help to neutralize this. So as hydronium begins to increase, your body will produce bicarbonate to help neutralize that. And bicarbonate then becomes carboxylic acid. Okay. Now you have carboxylic acid. And if OH increases, like maybe I get too much ammonia in my system, carboxylic acid can then absorb, or donate, I should say, the H that it just got from this, can donate that to make water to neutralize it and then go back to bicarbonate. So there's a balance, a delicate balance that's happening within your system. It's called a buffer. Um, Water is very good as being a buffer on some level. It can do that, but you need something basic to cancel out something acidic. And so some real world application for my medical people. This is what diabetic ketoacidosis is. It's whenever you have a slight deviation from the pH in your blood. It doesn't have enough insulin, your body's to allow glucose to enter the cells. And we'll talk about this in our metabolism portion. Um, so because it cannot get the glucose into the cells for energy, it breaks down fat really fast, and it produces something called ketones. Let me get my produces something called ketones, which are acidic in nature. So the acidity rises, they're acidic byproducts, and you get this pH imbalance. Your acidity drops, or your pH drops, acidity rises, and then you end up having you don't have enough bicarbonate to neutralize the the pH in your system. You end up sweating, passing out. I had a friend that who was diabetic. This happened to him. But yeah, it's very, very detrimental to diabetics if there's no intervention. So a little bit to touch on to end here is when we get to we've talked about oxygen, talked about water, but carbon is also very important. And um, go to my whiteboard here. Carbon is nice because this is what you talk about when you talk about organic chemistry. Okay, organic chemistry is carbon. Anything with carbon. Now, if I go back to my uh, board here, my periodic table, sorry, and I zoom in on carbon, carbon is in this fourth group here. So that fourth group means it has four valence electrons. And so let's go back to my whiteboard. Yeah, so carbon has four valence electrons. Carbon's nice because it wants eight, and it also could stand to get rid of them all. It doesn't care. It's kind of neutral. So carbon creates a very stable backbone whenever it's binding to stuff like hydrogen. It doesn't want to necessarily get rid of anything. So carbon can actually bind to a hydrogen, a hydrogen, a hydrogen, and a hydrogen. And it's nonpolar. A lot of your fats are have carbon hydrogen backbones. These are very stable mechanisms. These are very stable molecular interactions, is carbon and hydrogen. When I introduce oxygen into the system, then it starts becoming polar. But carbon's very nice because it doesn't necessarily want to go in either direction. Stable backbone, it can create these great chains. And if I'm going to talk a little bit about your organic chemistry, um, carbons form these lovely carbon backbone chains. Now remember, carbon wants eight electrons. So here's the thing. It wants eight in its valence. So right here between these carbons, right here, and this is your organic chemistry, this line means that these are connected, so they're sharing. So H, H, H. So this right here, it has four valence electrons because it's sharing one with the carbon. H, 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 H. And when we get into macromolecules, I'll go into this a little bit more. But as you can see, all these carbons have, get another color here, have four. The far end doesn't have that second carbon attached to it, so it has to have one with three hydrogens. Okay, but this creates a very stable backbone. In fact, if you go into organic chemistry, we don't even label the carbons a lot of times, and we don't even label hydrogens. So you would see this particular orientation. Every vertex here is a carbon, and then because you know that this is carbons bonded twice, you know everything else is a hydrogen. So if you ever see stuff like this, that's organic chemistry notation. Um, but carbon is very versatile with bonding. Carbon can even form double bonds, so it can even form a double bond. That's two. Um, that's two valence electrons bonding, so it just needs two more. So it can go H and H, H and H. You know, we talk about methane. I talked about that earlier. CH4 again. C, and then it just surrounded by hydrogens, but in a very non-polar way. Water would not dissolve this stuff. Again, these are constituting of your fats and anything that's insoluble. Okay. So yeah. Um, and those carbon-carbon bonds, this is something that it talks about. This is actually kind of big. Those carbon-carbon bonds are high energy. Those carbon-hydrogen bonds, we have something called hydrocarbons. This is where you get a lot of your fossil fuels. Um, yeah. So, um, what element is the foundational component of all organic compounds? It's carbon. Okay. Um, Carbon is foundational. And again, I talked about it just a second ago, but because it has carbon and it's got those four valence electrons, and those valence it can go in either direction. It can gain it, it can lose it. This is a quality called tetravalency. Okay. Tetravalency just means it has four, it needs four more, it could lose four. It doesn't, it can do either, or it's very stable. And this is actually something that's really nice with carbon. It can form double bonds, triple bonds, single bonds. It doesn't care how it gets to eight. it's happy either way. Whereas if you get to oxygen, and again, this is why oxygen is more electronegative. Let's go back to our periodic table. So let's zoom. Well, so as I have four here, five here, six here. Oxygen, it's closer to this edge, which is why it wants to gain electrons. Okay. These guys here can do whatever you want. No, they can do whatever. They can go either direction, which is why in a lot of science fiction novels, a lot of the aliens are said to be silicon-based life forms because they're tetravalency. So food for thought there, a little tidbit. We're almost done, guys. So what element's the foundational component for all organic compounds? It's carbon. It's because it's tetravalent, forms great chains, multiple bonds, very versatile. And just a little bit to end here. There's just some functional groups if you ever hear them when you're talking about organic chemistry, something to think about. You're not going to be quizzed on this, but OH groups are referred to as hydroxyl. This guy right here, this COOH is a carboxyl group. A carbonyl is a carbon double bonded to an oxygen. Amino group, methyl group, that methane, that's phosphate group. We'll talk about phosphate when we talk about ADP and ATP. So phosphate comes off of that. That's a good that one I'll probably use more often than not, or more than the other ones. And last but not least, just other functional groups. You don't need to know this. I threw this in here just to let you know more about organic functional groups. So that being said, that's gonna sum it up for this week. Like I said, if you have questions, comments, concerns, you just let me know and send me an email. I'll respond to it. But yeah, hopefully this makes sense, and you'll have your assignments due at the end of the week. I hope you have a great rest of the week.